Well, good afternoon. I'm so glad to see you because it proves my instinct was right. I twisted an arm because I have questions that I wanted to know, and I thought that you might too. So there was a brief moment earlier today when I thought, what if nobody shows up? But you are great. I'm so glad you're here. Now, this is the real Mike Murphy. I understand that on 1391 it showed some official that's in the top brass. But this is the real Mike Murphy. And yes, you know the best introduction, that he's the son-in-law of Janet Schaefer. So welcome, Mike Murphy. I'm going to get over and run the camera, but thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I will say that if there's a question that he's asked that's sort of shouldn't be answered in public, he's going to have that right to do that, and you will honor that, I know. But thank you for coming. Yay. Thank you for agreeing to speak.
Okay. All right, can you all hear me? Am I good? All right, I have my microphone monitor back here telling me. All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon. It's a huge honor to be here. As my introduction, my name is Mike Murphy. That's a very common name, as you can imagine. I think there are 8 other Mike Murphys in the State Department, and I get their emails probably on a weekly basis. So the fellow who is in the advertisement is actually an assistant secretary and probably would not think kindly that I'm using his name in vain. So yeah, so please, that's somebody much more important than I. And so, again, my name is Mike Murphy. I'm actually a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel. I spent 22 years in the Army. And during that experience, I ran across people in the State Department. I worked in 2 embassies, one in Turkey and one in Tel Aviv, Israel, as an Army officer. And I thought, wow, this is an interesting group of people to be working with. And so has anybody in the group actually worked or known somebody to work in an embassy? I assume there would be at least one. Where was that, ma'am? Wow. How about that?
I don't know exactly where he was, but they had to walk from wherever he sent his family out 6 weeks before.
How about, so your husband's uncle was one of the last diplomats to leave when the Chinese communists took over. Exactly. How about that? Wow. So,
Mike, they're asking if you'll take your mask
take it off? Okay.
off. Just stay away from me.
All right. I'm a bit of a wanderer when I speak, so yeah. Just push me away if that's okay. Yeah. Yes, sir.
We have a friend that's actually currently in Bangkok, in Thailand, in the embassy.
All right. Yeah. So.
It's a military attaché.
Okay. So that's a great point. I was a military attaché myself, and I served in the embassy in Tel Aviv, and so it's a very interesting dynamic that in the embassy, most people who work there are not State Department people. Most people are Department of Defense. Their Department of Agriculture. I think in Tel Aviv we had NASA, we had CDC, we had USAID, the Agency for International Development. But the biggest group of people who work at any embassy are actually the local staff. And so we were in Podgorica, Montenegro, where my wife Carolyn, who's right there, we were both there. That's actually Janet's daughter. She just inherited me. So while we were there were only 30 Americans, but 150 local staff. And so we couldn't do our job without the local Montenegrins who came to work every day. And if you can imagine the Russians who show up at Embassy Moscow, how difficult their life is working for the Americans. And you may have been following the news that there's been some unpleasantness with the Russian government working with the Russian local staff. And so my heart goes out to them because that's an extremely difficult decision to decide to work for Americans if you're in a place like Russia or Cuba or Vietnam or other countries like that. So just put in perspective that it's mostly not Americans working at the embassies and mostly not State Department folks working at the embassies. There's the Marine Corps sends security detachments out to protect us, and they're all 18, 19 years old. In fact, my job was to give passports to young Marines, and one had never had a passport before. He was so young. And when he walked in, I looked at his birthday. I was like, I was already in my late 40s when this gentleman was born. But I got nothing on you guys, so I'll keep that. So again, I said I was in the Army. I started out as a helicopter pilot, and then at my year 12 of service, I was offered an opportunity to become what's called a foreign area officer. And what that is you become a specialist in a geographical region. And I happen to be a Middle East guy. And so I changed from being a pilot to being a Middle East foreign area officer. I went to Turkey, and I learned Turkish. And I was an exchange student there at the age of 42, I think I was. And it was really like jumping in the deep end of the pool. As my classes were in Turkish, I had a sponsor who could not speak English to me. He was forbidden. He only spoke Turkish to me. And so my Turkish got pretty good pretty quickly. Then I went to the embassy in Ankara, and I was an aide to a general. Then I went to Tel Aviv, to Baghdad. I did my service in Iraq, and then went straight to Afghanistan. And when I was in Afghanistan, my wife said, I have enough of this, you being away from home. So she joined the State Department, and she became a Foreign Service specialist. And we'll talk about the difference between that and a generalist here in just a few minutes. So does anybody have any idea how many Foreign Service officers and specialists there are in the whole world? There's only 13,000. So there are more people at Fort Bragg than there are Foreign Service officers and specialists. But then there are 45,000 local staff. So you can see it's about 3 times as many foreigners, so to speak, work for the State Department than Americans. And that's a really significant issue, because when I was in Montenegro, I was only there for 2 years, but some of the people had been working there for 20 years, some of the local staff, and they know the issues, they know the countries, and so we rely on them so heavily for information about culture, about language, about what's going on politically, about what's going on in Parliament, and why did this minister quit, and they had a fight with this guy. So we rely so heavily on that staff, and we're very blessed to have them. Another little background piece, the State Department was the first executive arm of the government. So when the government was first founded, after the Constitution, we got our independence from Great Britain, they decided that the first minister should be the Secretary of State. And that was back in 1789, and that's why the Secretary of State is the first person after the President, the Vice President, the Speaker, and the President of the Senate would be in line to become the President. And so that's a very important position. Right now it's Tony Blinken. He's our secretary, who's a bit of a professional diplomat, has been doing this a long time. And under him, there are 8 different bureaus, and one of those is the Bureau for Policy. And under that policy is all the regions of the world. And so there's the Bureau for Africa, there's a Bureau for Europe, the Bureau for Asia, and the South Pacific. There's a bureau for what we call the Western Hemisphere, which is North and South America. And so I, as a diplomat in Africa, will work for the Africa Bureau, and I'll be a consular officer, which is another part of the government. So I have many different bosses at one time. And so when I get there, I'll be working in what's called the consulate section, and that is the part that issues visas, or actually interviews people to be qualified for either non-immigrant visas, which means you're going as a tourist or a student or a special program, or immigrant visas. And so each country of the world is allocated a certain number of immigrants every year that can come to the States. And it's a bit of a long and difficult process, but that'll be my job. I'll get to choose who gets to be an American, which is quite a huge responsibility. And at night, I sometimes have a nightmare about it, making sure I get the right choice. The other thing I get to do, and my favorite, is to issue birth certificates. And so let's say a young naval aviator in Rota, Spain, his wife or her has a baby in Spain. It's a consular officer like me that gives them a birth certificate and makes that person an American. And so it's a bit of a process, but when I actually issue and hand them the birth certificate, mom and dad, it really is an emotional thing for me. My father's an immigrant from Ireland. And so both of my sisters were born in Germany, and they have some young consular officer like me, or younger than me, I suppose, gave them their birth certificates in Germany. So there's a connection. All right. How did I become a Foreign Service officer? Is a question I get all the time. Now, is there anybody here who's younger than 59? Okay. So I imagine you have children maybe and grandchildren who would like to be diplomats or who are interested in being a diplomat. So the first requirement is that you have to be less than 59 years old when you start. So when I started, I was the oldest person in my class. And I was 23 years older than the youngest person in my class. And yeah, and she was amazing. She was actually a world champion judo athlete who had decided she wanted to be a diplomat and had graduated with her master's degree from a very prestigious university at age 21, I believe it was. And this is the quality of people that I was in class with. That wasn't me. I was just the old guy. But the people that we're bringing into the State Department nowadays is amazing. And I'm super proud to even have passed the procedure. And what that procedure is you have to first decide what it is that you want to do. And there's 5 types of Foreign Service officers. There's consular officers like me who deal with visas, who deal with issuing passports, who do birth certificates, who go to the jail to help out the American who was arrested, which I've done several times. And you go in there and it's just you and the person sitting there, and you are required by law to make sure that they're being protected in the foreign jail. That's one of the big things during COVID was my responsibility to evacuate the Americans from Montenegro. And so Montenegro being a small country, we are able to find planes to come in, and we evacuated 106 Americans who were stranded because they shut down all the exits to Montenegro in one day. Airport shut down, border shut down, the ships not coming in. And so we scrambled to find airlines that would do a charter flight into Montenegro, pick up foreigners, and fly them out. So that was neat. The other types of Foreign Service officers are the management officers, and they're the ones who come and fix your plumbing at the middle of the night. They're the ones who do the budget. They're the ones who take care of the medical care of all the diplomats at the embassy, and they manage basically the embassy. Then you have the economic officers who deal with the host nation on developing their economy. And you can imagine a relationship with a country like France, that could be 30 people in that section, considering how much trade we have with France. In Montenegro, we had 2 people because we don't do much except sell them yacht parts, believe it or not. It's the biggest import into Montenegro. Yes. If you've been to Montenegro, you'll know it's a big haven for yacht-owning type people. So I'll leave it at that. Then you have public diplomacy people who are the people who sell America to the host nation. They do television programs, and now that we have social media, Facebook campaigns, they manage programs to bring young students to America. I know we have some people who have hosted foreign exchange students here. I'm sure there's plenty here. That the State Department runs that program and brings people to the States. It's really neat to do the interview because some of these people had never traveled out of their home country, and I'm issuing their visa to say, okay, you're going to Durham, North Carolina to be an exchange high school student, and they're so excited, and so that's really neat. And then you have the political officers, and those are what I say is like the infantry officers of the State Department. They're the really smart people who become ambassadors someday, and they deal with our relationship with the Parliament and the President and the Prime Minister. And so I really had no desire to be a political officer just because you have to be super smart, and I just didn't quite feel like I was the person to do that. The other choice, you can be a specialist, and my wife Carolyn was a specialist in the State Department for 8 years. Is that right? 6 years, sorry. And there are 8 categories of specialists. So you have the Foreign Service officers, and then you have the Foreign Service specialists, and they're the doctors and the nurses and the information technology, the IT folks, the office managed specialists. They run the embassy on like kind of the technical level, where the officers are out there making bad decisions. The specialists are running the embassy behind them. You understand that. So I was making a lot of bad decisions, and my wife Carolyn, I'm very proud to say, was the ambassador's personal assistant in Algeria, and she was hand-chosen, like kind of picked out of one embassy and brought to Algeria because of her wonderful reputation. And so specialists have that flexibility where officers do not. So then you decide, okay, I want to be a diplomat, and I want to be a consular officer like Mike Murphy. And so you take this test called the Foreign Service Officer Test. And it's a test of written English, history, culture, general knowledge about the states. I remember one of the questions was, how many Supreme Court justices do we have? It's 9, right? Yeah, okay, all right, so I got that one right. So things like that, like how much do you know about America? And if you pass that test, then you move on and they tell you to write biography. Like, why am I a person who would be a good diplomat? Well, mine was because I had followed my wife to Belgium, Algeria, Sri Lanka, and I had previously served in embassies as a military attaché. And so I had a bit of a background. So State Department said, well, we'll let this Mike Murphy guy go to the next step. And you get to the oral exams. And it's a full day of interviews. And you go there at like 6 in the morning, and you're sweating it out all day. You don't want to, get too nervous, but you don't want to get too relaxed. And you are basically, they're evaluating everything you do or say for the full day. And they give you a score. And it's from 0 to 7, and you have to get a 5.25 to pass. And I got a bit of a help because I was a veteran, and they gave me a couple extra points. If you were ever in the Peace Corps, you get a couple extra points. And if you speak foreign languages, they add a little extra points. And so at the end of the day, you have a score, and then you're racked against everybody who's applied. And we have about 20,000 applicants, between 10 and 20,000 applicants a year, and they choose about 400. So it's a bit of a process. How I got in, I have no idea, but I slipped in, and I went off to Sri Lanka first with Carolyn, and then I started my class back in September 2018. It's what they call A100, and you're in there in your first day in the State Department, and you look around, and my classmates were Harvard graduates, Duke graduates. I think there were 3 Duke graduates actually in my class. There were people who had served in the Marine Corps. There were couple older folks like me, one was a retired Marine colonel and another retired Army officer. People who had walked across South America, people who had taught Chinese in China, and it's just this amazing group to belong to, and I felt super humbled to be part of that. So did my training, learned Montenegrin with Carolyn. It was my 6th foreign language. We learned it, and off we went to Montenegro, where I was the lowest ranking person in the embassy. And so it was a bit of a transition for me, having a full career in the Army, but I really, really enjoyed it. And one of the biggest benefits of being in a small embassy is that you get to do everything, because there's only so many people to do it. So one of my favorite tasks was to drive to Kosovo. Does anybody know? So Montenegro is in the Balkans in Europe, and Kosovo was part of ex-Yugoslavia. And I drove there because we didn't have any turkeys for Thanksgiving. And so the ambassador said, who wants to drive to Kosovo to go pick up turkeys for the community? And so Mike Murphy said, I'll do it. And so myself and a local staff drove 5 hours to the nearest, we say the commissary, like basically supermarket, and we bought like $1,200 worth of turkeys and drove back. And so those are the types of things that you think, oh, as a diplomat, who would do things like that? Well, it's all part of the amazing variety of things that you can do. And so my last piece is that we're going now to Liberia on the west coast of Africa. And if anybody knows anything about the history of Liberia, it was actually founded as a country, as a place for either free black Americans or freed slaves who were sent there starting in the 1820s. And the last person to go from the U.S. to Liberia was in 1904. And so during probably your parents' lifetime, I'm guessing, maybe, that we sent somebody from the U.S. voluntarily to Liberia to found a new nation for people who had either been enslaved or were free blacks in America. And so we are very much looking forward to that experience. They do speak English there. I was asked that, so I don't have to learn language number 7. But that history and that relationship with us will be extremely interesting to me. And so I'm going to leave it there for any questions you have. And yes, sir?
I'm just curious. I might have missed this because I came in a little bit
Yeah.
late, but I'm curious what your academic background was to go where you went.
Okay. So I had to have a bachelor's degree, and I had a degree in history because that was the easiest thing I can think of before I went into the Army, and I was commissioned as an officer in the Army. And then while I was in the Army, I got a master's degree in Alabama in international relations. And so that helped me in the process of writing. You don't actually have to have a degree to be a foreign service generalist. Although it's highly, highly recommended. I imagine 0.0001% may have that. But if you have a degree in a foreign language or international relations or political science, that tends to be kind of the general one that you're looking for. But if you want to be a management officer and you have an econ degree or administration, that would fit into that specialty or that cone. So your bachelor's degree doesn't so much matter, but if you have a master's, that's really the one that counts. Yeah. So with that, the State Department has special programs for young folks to get a free master's degree to go study a specific, like international relations, and then they're brought directly into the State Department. And they are super impressive because they go to schools like Tufts or Harvard or Columbia or Duke, where it's extremely competitive to get in, and they're fully paid. And all of those students come from minority backgrounds to make the State Department more reflective of American society. And the people who were in my class were amazing, and I felt humbled to be even in the same class with them. So thank you for your question, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a choice of where you're going?
So do we have a choice where we're going? So your first 2 tours are what we call directed tours. And you get a list, and there were 82 of us, and there were 85 choices. And they said, put them from 1 to 85. And you racked them. And we actually put Burkina Faso as our first choice. If you know where that is, it's Central Africa. It's a French-speaking country. And we thought, who else is going to ask for Burkina Faso? And we didn't get it. And my mother-in-law, Janet, was there. And boy, her face was super surprised when I got Montenegro because it wasn't my first choice. But it was a blessing. So you get to choose, but then they choose for you. On your third assignment, you get a lot more flexibility. It's the first 2 are like you're a young lieutenant or a private, and they are going to send you where they need you. The third one, you get to project. You get a list of all the places around the world where you can go. And so Liberia was also our first choice as a second tour. But our third choice, actually next year, we'll get another list, and you pick.
So how long is the tour?
So the first 2 tours are 2 years each. Then the standard tour after that is 3, unless you go to a place like Afghanistan or Iraq, where it's only 1 year. And so depending on how hard it is. And you can go to a place like France, where 3 years seems to go like that, or you can go to a place like Liberia, where 2 years will seem to be forever. So they try to balance it out. So, good question. Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, you said that English was your major language there.
Right.
Do you have a local language for the local people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Liberia, English is the standard language, but there are 31 local languages there. Because Liberia was kind of an artificial country founded by these settlers, and so the tribes or nations who were inland they didn't consider themselves Liberian at all. They were like the natives here when the English settlers first came. So when somebody comes in for an interview, and I have to do it, if they can't speak English, then the local staff will help as much as they can to interpret. So, for instance, I worked in Sri Lanka, and there are 3 languages, English, Sinhala, and Tamil. And so the local staff, to be hired, had to speak all 3 languages. And so it was a very particular group of people who can work in an embassy. And so in Liberia, I don't believe there's somebody who can speak 31 languages, but in the staff somewhere, there's supposed to be people who help you if they can't speak. So
You had to learn the language in Montenegro.
I did, and Carolyn and I were the 2 in a class. It was just the 2 of us and a teacher. And so the thing I learned most was my relationship with my wife, if you can imagine, spending 8 hours a day together for 7 months. So she learned a lot about me as well. But we were assigned a teacher from Montenegro, and she taught us from hello, good morning, dobro jutro, to at the end I was able to ask you, why do you want to go to the States, and do you have a brother who lives there, and all these other questions. It's a pretty amazing process. That was on my 6th foreign language at that point. So don't ask me to say all of them, but so I could give you a sample of each. So in Turkish, so I'll say good morning. So günaydın is good morning in Turkish, and bonjour in French, and sabah khair in Arabic, and boker tov in Hebrew, dobro jutro in Montenegrin. What am I missing? Maybe that's it. Guten Morgen in German. I don't know, yeah. So they start to fade in the back of your brain, as you can imagine. But right now, Montenegrin is my strongest language. Yeah. So, and Farsi is one that when I went to Afghanistan, I learned that as well. Yeah. So, yes, ma'am.
Do they provide you furnished housing when you move to a new place?
That is a great question. Do they provide us furnished housing? Most embassies, and there's 276 missions around the world. Doesn't mean 276 embassies, because you can have an embassy, and you can have a consulate, and you can have a presence post, and then you can have, there's one special place in the whole world, and that's Taiwan. And we don't have an embassy there because officially we recognize the China, the People's Republic of China's embassy. And so we have a special mission to Taiwan. But anyways, normally they do give us a nice apartment with furniture. And the funny thing is, for years and years and years, the furniture was Drexel Heritage. Does anybody know Drexel Heritage? It's from North Carolina, right? So everywhere we went, and all the posts we went, we had the same table, we had the same hutch, we had the same drawers. It felt like home as soon as you walked into the apartment, just that it was somewhere else, right? So recently, I understand Drexel Heritage went out of business. Is that right? And so we had to find a new contractor. So when we get to Liberia, I don't know what we're going to do. It'll look so foreign. But what's that?
Made out of sticks.
It sticks. That's exactly right. To like blend into the native population, yeah. So they try to give you a standard feeling house. And over the years, it's become, security has become really, really important. So the apartments or houses that they find for us, and that's what the management officer does. He goes out, or she goes out and finds suitable apartments for Americans, which mostly means security. Do they have a secure road? Is there 2 ways out of the building? Is there bars on the window, depending on where you're at? And it's generally very nice. And we just found out where we're going to live in Liberia, and we're super happy. It's a 7-minute walk from the embassy, but it's in the path of the migrating bats. So that'll be neat. We understand thousands and thousands and thousands of bats will fly over our house during migration season. Yeah. So we'll send pictures. Yeah. So, but they do take care of us. Yes, sir.
Mike, do you have any idea how much of the State Department personnel turns over when the change at the presidential level occurs?
That's a really great question. So when the administration changes, how many personnel in the State Department change over? So there's a certain percentage of ambassadors who are appointed directly by the president, and it changes from administration to administration. And the previous administration, oh my gosh, do you remember how many ambassadors? Yeah, so they definitely change over. So if you're a car salesman who donated to the certain campaign and you've been appointed to the embassy in Italy, for instance, you will change. But the professional ambassadors, who I think are about 60 to 75%, they don't change. The president can always change. Like one day, he could just call the embassy and say, "Ambassador, you're done. Go home." And that happens, fortunately, not that often, but it does happen. So at least the ambassadors, so probably 30 to 40% of the ambassadors. And then the president can also appoint what are assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries and undersecretaries. So really, it's at the highest level. So as far as pure numbers, it's not that many, because most of us are either the civil servants who work for the embassy, the local staff, or the professional specialists and generalists. So I'm just guessing maybe 5% of the people change over, if that. What do you think, Carolyn? It is hard to say, yeah. But it's really just the top level folks. It's not the knuckleheads like me. Yeah, so thank you for your question. Ma'am?
And how much problem is it for the functioning of our State Department abroad to have policies change at the higher level?
That's a very good question. So it's a problem, I won't say a problem, it's a challenge traditionally for diplomats of every country. When the administration or the president and the prime minister or government change, we are the executors. Whatever the president's policy is, whatever their priority is, we are the ones who execute it. And sometimes it's a bit of a U-turn, and you're going in the opposite direction that you were. And so there is this period of transition where the incoming administration is allowed to kind of project, this is how we're thinking, to give us time to prepare for that change. Conversely, all the embassies are feverishly writing papers to give to the new administration and say, hey, this is the situation on the ground, so they're prepared. And so it's a two-way conversation. In fact, I wrote a small article for a magazine about Montenegro's relationship with NATO. The previous administration had one view of our relationship with the NATO countries. The new administration has a different view. And so I wrote a small article about how I think the new administration should more engage Montenegro in NATO. And so, yes, it can be very difficult, and especially when the ambassador on the day after Inauguration Day, okay, you've got 3 days to leave, and they go on. But the professionals who are below the level of ambassador have been doing this for 10, 15, 20, 25 years and are used to the transition. So I've been with Carolyn through 3 presidents now. Yeah, is that right? Yeah, 3 administrations. And so you see it, but you try to keep the waves as minimal as possible. In a country like Montenegro, it's not super high on the priority list. Probably the waves are very little, but a place like the UK or Germany or France, probably the change is much more drastic. So, yeah. Thank you. Sir?
There's apparently been a couple hundred State Department people working in different areas around the world who have been assailed by some mysterious kinds of sound weapons or radio frequencies.
Right.
Do you have any concern about that? And what kind of things, what kind of discussions are going on within the State Department about those things?
That's a really great question. So the question is about, it's been in the newspapers, we call open source information about some American diplomats in Cuba specifically and in Beijing, in China, somewhere in China, have been targeted by some mystery. In Moscow. Is it Moscow too, yeah. Some people, I'll get you, sir, yeah. Will suddenly feel ill and they believe that it's some kind of targeted weapon. What I can say is that the State Department takes this very seriously, and the family members and the members of every mission in the world have been briefed on protective measures that can be taken, which I can't really talk about, and the possibility of it happening. So right now it's at a very low level. Information is available in the open press, like I said. But yeah, we're aware, and one of the interesting parts of my job because it's such a small embassy, I was the backup regional security officer. They said, Mike, you know about guns, you can be the security officer. I was like, okay. And so I was kind of drafted into being the assistant diplomatic security officer. And so I helped provide information to the family members, which are considered all part of the community, and the direct hires, we say, for our awareness. But at this point, we don't really have anything more specific than what's in the newspapers, but we do continue to monitor. It is a very serious situation. We face a lot other dangers like malaria and dengue fever. We had in Sri Lanka, what was the fever that was there? It was dengue fever. We had dengue fever, and several members of the mission got dengue fever. And so those kind of things kind of overwhelm your life more than the very off chance that something like that. Now, it's very serious, don't get me wrong, but our security posture is more about those types of things. And when we move to Liberia, we'll be taking malaria medicine, which supposedly makes you have vivid dreams and mood swings. So looking forward to that. And we will boil our own water and things like that. So on a day-to-day basis, it's really those things. I also did a tour in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Tel Aviv, in Israel, which had their own security issues. And the State Department actually does a very good job of keeping us informed and within a bubble. We're not soldiers. Well, I used to be one, but we're not equipped to defend ourselves, to be honest with you. And so not putting us in those situations is the best protective way. So I hope that answers your question, sir. Yeah. Sir?
I have 2 questions
Yeah.
that are a little different. One of them is, I think most of us don't really have a good feel, but we suspect that the official ambassadors are appointed for gratuitous reasons.
and not for their qualifications. And I'm just curious, from your point of view, what percentage of those ambassadors are both picked and function, they succeed, to demonstrate their expertise with that particular country and as an ambassador in general? That's question number one.
Okay.
Question number two is, I was wondering if you guys are always compounded, in a compound where you have good security around the perimeter, or are you just scattered all over the facility or the country where you're
Okay.
assigned?
Let me do two first. Question number two. Yeah. So the question was, are we always in a compound and always protected? We're not, actually. So it depends on the country. Like Iraq, when I was there, I was actually not with the State Department. I was actually in the Army at the time. But the compound itself literally had 30-foot high walls and security, and so that's one extreme. There are places like India or that have a compound where some of the people live and some people live off. In Pakistan, everybody lives within a compound. In a place like Montenegro, there was no compound at all. And we lived in a building with just regular Montenegrins, and we walked to work, and there was no security issues at all. In Liberia, we won't be in a compound, but we're all relatively close to the embassy that we could get there in a hurry if we needed to. And as another point is, the Marines aren't there to protect us. They're there to protect classified information. That's their job. So, we are expendable, so to speak. When it comes to protecting, they are protecting the embassy. And if we're out there, now DS, the diplomatic security, will protect us 100% as much as they can. But the movies have maybe portrayed it as the Marines are there to protect the diplomats. That's not the case at all. They're there to protect the embassy and the information contained inside it. And then your first question, so that's a great question, and I think about this quite a bit. So some ambassadors are appointed based on their connection and their contributions to a campaign. And that's the reality, and it's always been that way in the United States. The other side of that is that if I am a political appointee and let's just say I'm the ambassador to Canada, just say. Not a great example, but the Canadian government knows that I personally know the president because I donated to his campaign. There's an assumption that a politically appointed ambassador will have better connections than some guy like me who joined the State Department 30 years ago and worked his way up the ranks and is just a civil servant, basically. And so it depends on how you look at it. Some ambassadors are more in tune with the country they're working with than others. They have a connection. Some will have a long history of their family either being, like, let's just say Polish, and they're the ambassador to Poland, and they speak the language, and there's some connection, and sometimes they're not. And one of the challenges for a foreign service professional, a foreign service officer, and specialist is dealing with people coming into this community who may have never worked at an embassy before in their life. But the idea is that they have, if they want to call the president, then they can call the president directly. And the local governments look favorably upon that. So it's a balance. And absolutely, there are professionals who show up as ambassadors who aren't necessarily experts in the job they're going to be in either. We try to do that. We try to line up people to be like, oh yeah, you served in the Balkans before, you speak the language, blah, blah. But sometimes, as human resources work, sometimes you don't get an exact match. Montenegro was interesting. Our ambassador was neither, actually. She was foreign commercial service. And so the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Commerce has a certain number of ambassadors they're allowed to have. And so the one in Montenegro was great. We really, really liked her. She had a background in developing commercial ties with countries. And the State Department decided that Montenegro needed more tie, and so they took her from the Department of Commerce. She was a foreign commercial service officer and made her the ambassador to Montenegro. And she was great. I mean, she could talk economics all day long that I had never understood. So yeah, but it was like that. So it's a very good question, and I think a lot of people who aren't really in the process can really question, like, well, you just happen to be a rich guy or a rich lady who donated a bunch of money. Why do you get to be an ambassador? Well, there are reasons, and there are ambassadors who don't get approved, because of their lack of ability. The Senate has to approve the ambassadors, and sometimes they don't make it through. Not all the time, but sometimes. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Ma'am?
One question, but maybe just one comment. An example of someone appointed, I don't remember what country, but Shirley Temple Black.
Uh-huh. It was Liberia.
And they questioned, some of the reporters interviewing her, questioned her credentials, and she said, I've always been a quick study.
That's a very good point. I'm sorry.
The question that I have, do you find it's hard to have a normal life? In work like that, it takes over your life. I worked for a member of Congress for 10 years, and here in the district as a congressional aide, but you just get so involved in it, it kind of can take over your life. You read the news based on what's coming into the office and just stuff like that. So is it hard to have a normal life?
That's a great question. So she mentioned that Shirley Temple.
Ask his wife.
Yeah, I was going to say. That's exactly what I was going to say.
First, you have to define a normal life.
That's right. So first, she pointed out that Shirley Temple became, actually, I think it was Ghana. She was appointed ambassador. Shirley Temple from the old movies as Shirley Temple Black, was later appointed ambassador to, I believe it was Ghana, not Liberia. But her statement was, hey, I'm a smart person, I can figure this out. And a lot of ambassadors who were not professional diplomats do. I mean, they're successful business people or academics or professors, and they can figure it out on the go. And if they have a strong professional staff at the embassy, they can make it work. It's when there's a disconnect between the staff and the ambassador that can be quite difficult. But then your question about normal life. So that's a very good question. Maybe Carolyn has some ideas on this. But when we come back to the U.S., we realize that we are very disconnected from what's going on in normal America. The things that are changing, the prices of food, the distances you have to drive, the kind of the realities of a life in America can catch up to you. I mean, we were out for 2 years. We did not come to the United States for 2 years. So many things have changed. Yes, so Carol now has the mic.
Oh gosh, I wasn't prepared to speak. I mean, because I was in the State Department for a short period of time, I can say that I did find that sometimes it can take over your life. When I was administrative assistant to the ambassador, you really couldn't unplug. You had to check your email at night. You had to check it on weekends. You never really could get away from it. So in that sense, you kind of always felt like you were on the clock. I mean, you could never, as a diplomat, not represent your country. So you had to be aware of all the time being a representative and wanting to be on your best behavior and be the best representative you could be. So in that sense, I think I've learned to understand, just like a soldier is never off duty either, as a diplomat, it's the same thing. But I'm going to personally confess that when I came back a little bit early to visit with Mom, and we went to Costco. I was so overwhelmed that I actually cried. I cried in the parking lot when we got done. I'm like, there are too many choices. I'm not used to all this abundance. Because you're overseas for so long, you just somehow get disassociated with life in America. So I think it all sort of came out at Costco.
So with that, we are by law required to come back to the U.S. between assignments, a minimum of 20 days, right? 20 working days. Yeah, and so you have to get a special waiver, and it's really kind of a painful process to not come back between assignments for that very reason, because it's really easy to forget what America is like when you're in this really weird environment where it's taken over your life, and you're in this embassy housing, and you have somebody who will come and fix your plumbing. It's a bit like Rosedale, actually. So think about it. You get used to that, and it's hard to transition. But I think, in Carol and I, we don't have any children, but for foreign service children, it's triple that. They go to these schools overseas where you may be the only American, or you may be in class with the president's kids, and there's 3 kids in your 3rd grade class, and it is very, very different than life back here. And so one of kind of a theme in the Foreign Service is Foreign Service kids, and they really do try, the Foreign Service, or the State Department in general tries to normalize that as much as possible by making the parents come back to the States so they can see their cousins. And but you see some extraordinary children. I'm thinking of somebody who lives in Slovenia right now who's fluent in 3 languages, and she's 8. And yeah, and her French is crazy. And so I think, well, how is she going to transition back to living in Virginia, going to a public school or whatever, when her classmates were diplomats from the Ukraine and Belarus and Africa? And so generally they do well in that transition, but for adults it's one thing, but for children I think it's much more challenging. So, sir.
What language do you speak at home?
Whatever my wife tells me.
And does that change depending on where you live?
That's a good question. It does change depending on where we live. So we pick up language like little phrases from the language that we're using on a daily basis that my wife will yell at me with. And so those are the important phrases. But we speak English at home. But when we're in Montenegro, we would say things like "Šta je to?" Like, what is that? Or like "Rega" in Hebrew means, wait a second, hold on a second. And so these little phrases have permeated our language, and sometimes we forget what language they are. We're like, where did we get that one? Yeah. And so...
she might need to have rebuttal on that one.
No comment.
And so it's really, it becomes so much part of your life, that language, that when you transition back to English, it somehow becomes an English word in your brain. It's like, I only ever say that. Like, there's a Tamil phrase in Sri Lanka that's ayo, and it literally means like, oh man, I really messed that up. And we say it all the time now, and we kind of forgotten where did we pick it up, you know? It's so, but there are Foreign Service families that speak the language, their target language, at home to their children as well. And to be honest with you, if the kid goes to school in that country, they're teaching the parents, as you can imagine. It's amazing. Sir?
I'm wondering if your perspective on your own country changes when you have these experiences in other lands. In other words, do we begin to see ourselves as others see us?
Wow. That's a great question, sir. The question is, by doing this type of life, being in the Foreign Service, how does your perspective change of America? How has it affected my perspective of America? That's a great question. You become very aware that your viewpoint is from the outside, and that it's very hard to understand what people are thinking when you're not in the middle of it. And so I think we watch the BBC or the French television more than we watch NBC, ABC, Fox, whatever. And so we don't get that like hardcore streamed biased view when we're watching it from outside. And so when we come back to the States, you find that people do watch the channels they want to watch in general. Like there are people who are definitely like generally watch other things, but you get more of an outsider's view of things. As the son of an immigrant, I have become much more patriotic being outside when you realize how good we have it here. Oh my gosh, that the challenges a normal Montenegrin faces compared to what we think are challenges in the States really puts it in perspective. You're like, wow. And not even talking about my time in Afghanistan and Iraq and Egypt and Turkey and Israel and Palestine. You really feel for them. And when my dad made that decision to apply for a visa back in 1959 or whatever to come to the States, and my mom's also more back Polish immigrants, like those decisions to come to the States, like were so fortunate for me, and I feel much more American in context. And it is a little difficult for me to see the conflicts and the bipolar situation that is in the States right now when you realize, oh my gosh, we have so much more in common and so much better here in the States than other folks in other countries. It was very difficult, and maybe a sensitive subject, to watch the Black Lives Matter movement go on from Montenegro, because Montenegrins would ask me about it as an American, and I had to face the reality of our history, of what has led to this. And it was extremely difficult to explain to a Montenegrin, well, wait a minute, you're the land of the free, and like everybody's equal. What's going on? And to have to express that to somebody, and sometimes in a foreign language, makes it a little more difficult. I hope I'm more realistic about American history and who we are as Americans, but I'm also so glad to be an American, so fortunate. And what does an American mean? To me, an American isn't where you're born, because clearly I'm giving birth certificates to people who were born in Montenegro to American parents, and they may not live in America for the next 15 years, but they're American citizens, and they're just as American as you and me. And so that concept of what is American is much more ephemeral. It's much more conceptual than, okay, I was born in North Carolina, I'm an American. To me, that's no longer the connecting tissue. It's how do you look at the world? I don't know, is that a good answer? But yes, it has impacted. Sir?
Can you make any comments about when you've been a career, I've forgotten your title, but in the diplomatic corps, and you've done this for probably 20 years or more.
So I did the Army for 22, and I'm really just a brand new, I've done it now, I've been in 3 years, 4 years, 3 years.
I'm curious if you can make generalizations about what do the people in your diplomatic arena, not necessarily the military, because I think the military people exit the military and do a relatively specific number of things that are related to their jobs. But can you make a generalization about what happens with diplomatic corps people when they leave the job in the diplomatic corps? I ask this question largely because my cousin also got a degree in history, and he was a diplomatic attaché in Morocco. And he left, and he never went back, and I haven't had a chance to talk with him and find out the whys and wherefores.
That's a really great question. So the question is, post-diplomatic life or post-foreign service life, what do people transition to generally? Yeah. So one thing to keep in mind is that the people who come into the foreign service come in with a vastly different or vast array of experiences. Lawyers, there are doctors who become foreign service officers, military folks, teachers. I mean, it's like the whole gamut of people. So generally, people who come in with a certain skills, if they get out after maybe 5 or 6 or 10 years, they'll have that opportunity to return to what they knew before. If you've been in 30 years and you get out as an ambassador, a lot of them get into academia and go on to teach at universities, and with that life of experience at dealing with prime ministers and ministers of defense and blah, 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 that it gives you an insight into that top level where, not where the sausage is made down here, but where the sausage is sold at the store. It's at the highest political level. And so it really depends on when you get out. Very few of the folks that we know that have been in have gotten out, that I can tell. I mean, it's a pretty good life. It's a really difficult to get through the process to start, but once you're in, it's a super fulfilling place to be. I can think of one person who got out as a diplomatic security agent. So he was a gun-toting, bodyguard type guy, and he got out and he got into LGBTQ rights advocacy in San Diego. And so that's quite a change. And so it's really kind of hard to predict. But I think for ambassadors, kind of the natural progression is think tanks. Although we have a friend who will probably get out as an ambassador who wants to work at, what's the store where you buy boxes? The Container Store, yeah. That's her dream, is to go to the Container Store and work there and stack the shelves. And she will, that's her life after ambassadorship. And we say, we're going to hold you to that. So because I'm a little older coming into the State Department, some of my, at least my age group peers are much higher in rank than I am. And so I'm allowed to kid with ambassadors that way. So, but that's a great question. I think this is it for us, right? My dream is to be a dishwasher in a pub. Yeah. Or I want to drive the golf carts here at Crowsdale for you guys. Yeah.
We've got openings.
Yeah, really, yeah. we have discussed this at length, that I thought after the pub opened, you'd have a lot of people who need a ride home, and I would drive the golf cart, and that would be my retirement career. So, but I think it also depends on your life experience in the State Department. If you've been to the Chads and the Central African Republics and Afghanistan and Iraq and the tough posts, you probably are like, okay, I'm done. But if you did your whole career, in Paris and London and Dublin, and you probably still have something left in you. I think that's the pattern, but I don't know. We don't know many people who've actually gotten out earlier than just retirement. Yeah, so, and it's a good government retirement. So you have the wherewithal to go to pottery school or whatever. So shoemaking school is another option for me. So, sir.
Are there CIA representatives in the embassy?
So
how do they interact with the ambassador?
So all the folks at an embassy are diplomats, and so I'm a Foreign Service officer. I entered to the State Department, and that we are all State Department employees. And so any other agency that works there is like the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security. They're all openly who they are, and so there's really nothing to hide. There's nothing that we keep under wraps or talk about like that. So the folks in embassy who are State Department folks are State Department folks. So yeah, that's a totally different process that I'm not really privy to. I don't know if anybody's son-in-laws work for that particular agency, but they would have to discuss that, yeah. So, yeah.
Is there any coordinated feedback system to the Secretary of State from all the different ambassadors? Are they required to send in monthly reports?
That's a great question, actually. So the question is, is there a process for the ambassadors or embassies to report back to the Secretary of State? And yeah, there is. So kind of feeding from the embassies, so like all the ones in Europe will feed to the Bureau of Eurasian Affairs, Europe, and then on a daily basis there's reporting going back, and it goes to what's the situation going on in Montenegro. And so I had the privilege during COVID, I was the guy writing that cable every day, and then it became every week, and then it became every 2 weeks as the situation stabilized, but of what the situation was specifically about COVID. And it went straight to the Secretary's office, at least. I don't know if he was reading Mike Murphy's writing, but there is a tremendous amount of loop feedback because the State Department is only one part of the decision-making process, because the President also has a national security advisor, he has the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, the other agencies that will feed information to the President. So the State Department is only one voice, and that voice is constantly going from the embassies to the ambassador. We also have something called a dissent channel, which is really interesting. If you are a young Foreign Service officer like me and you're on your first tour and you see some egregious abuse that's going on in the embassy or within the country, we are allowed to write a cable, we call it. A cable is basically an email directly to the Secretary and say, I, Mike Murphy, witnessed this egregious thing that happened. And the people who do that are extraordinarily brave, because you are bypassing the ambassador, your boss, the boss's boss, the boss's boss, all the way up to the top directly in what's called the dissent channel. But we absolutely have that privilege to do that. And it happens. I actually met a guy who wrote about things going on in Egypt. I can't remember exactly the topic, but he was a young diplomatic security officer, and he felt what was going on was inappropriate, and he wrote a dissent channel, and it went straight to the Secretary. And it was not a popular decision. It was not popular what he was talking about, but he was protected because we have this basically a complaint box type of situation, which we in the State Department pride ourselves on being honest in reporting, and that we should give everybody that ability to speak directly to the Secretary. And if you imagine, it's a kind of a small organization. When I was in the Army, 15,000 people was just one tiny part of this huge mass, but in the State Department, there's only 15,000 American Foreign Service and specialists. So, yeah. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I think it's been about an hour. Yeah. So I really appreciate your time. I'm really surprised how many folks are interested. And if you have grandchildren, children, however, I don't mean to make any assumptions, who want to go into this life It's amazing. I mean, I feel so blessed to have had two incredible careers. One, I was a helicopter pilot that I started my Army career with, and then became a Middle East